For decades, popular culture has sold us a lie. The katana is portrayed as the ultimate weapon, a blade so sharp it can cut through steel, a sword forged with mystical precision, a weapon that represents discipline, honor, and absolute mastery. Meanwhile, the European longsword is often dismissed as crude, heavy, clumsy, a blunt slab of iron swung by knights who relied more on armor than skill. If these stories were true, then the outcome should be obvious. A samurai should defeat a European knight, every time. But history tells a different story, and physics tells an even more uncomfortable one. When we strip away mythology, cinema, and national pride, something strange appears. In a direct physical confrontation, the katana is not the superior weapon. In fact, under most realistic combat conditions, the samurai is at a severe disadvantage. This is not about who was braver, not about culture, not about martial spirit. This is about mass, force, leverage, momentum, and energy transfer. And once you understand those principles, the romantic image of the katana begins to crack. The central question is simple, but dangerous. If the katana is so legendary, why did it never dominate armored warfare the way European swords did? Or more bluntly, what happens when myth collides with physics? Before answering that, we need to do something uncomfortable. We need to remove modern assumptions. Most people imagine sword combat as naked blade versus naked blade. Two warriors in light clothing, slashing freely, relying on speed and sharpness. That image is wrong, historically wrong, physically wrong, and tactically suicidal. Real medieval combat, both in Europe and Japan, was dominated by armor. And armor changes everything. Let's start with the environment each weapon evolved in. The katana emerged in feudal Japan, where armor was typically lamellar, made from leather and small iron plates, laced together with silk or leather cords. This armor was flexible, relatively light, and optimized for archery and cutting weapons. The European longsword evolved in a completely different ecosystem. By the 14th and 15th centuries, European knights were encased in full-plate armor, hardened steel, shaped to deflect blows, distributed across the entire body. This difference alone should already raise suspicion. Weapons are not invented in isolation. They are responses to problems. And the problem European knights faced was not, how do I cut better? It was, how do I transmit enough force through steel to disable a human being underneath? This is where physics enters the battlefield. Let's talk about mass and momentum. The katana is relatively light, typically around 1.1 to 1.3 kilograms, with a strong forward curve and a balance point optimized for slicing. Its design maximizes cutting efficiency, long draw cuts, clean entry, minimal resistance. The European longsword, contrary to popular belief, is not a crowbar. Most longswords weigh 1.4 to 1.6 kilograms, sometimes slightly more, but with a critical difference. They are longer, straighter, and designed for two-handed leverage. This matters because momentum is not just about weight. It is about mass times velocity times lever arm. A longer weapon, wielded with two hands, generates significantly more angular momentum. That momentum does not care about sharpness. It cares about energy transfer. Against an unarmored target, sharpness dominates. Against armor, force dominates. And this is where the katana's reputation begins to suffer. Sharp blades excel at cutting soft targets. But armor is not a soft target. Steel plate does not get cut. It must be deformed, penetrated, or transmitted through. European swordsmanship recognized this reality early. That is why longsword manuals emphasize techniques like half-swording, gripping the blade to use the sword like a spear, mordhau, striking with the pommel or crossguard like a hammer, thrusting into gaps rather than slashing. These techniques turn the sword from a cutting tool into a force delivery system. The katana, by contrast, is almost exclusively optimized for cutting arcs. Its curvature improves slicing efficiency but reduces thrusting power against rigid targets. Its construction favors edge retention and sharpness over impact survivability. This is not a flaw. It is a specialization, and specialization always has a cost. Now consider leverage and grip. The longsword is designed to be used with both hands, spaced apart, creating a long lever. This dramatically increases torque. Torque is what allows a knight to bind an opponent's weapon, redirect force mid-swing, drive thrusts through resistance. The katana is traditionally used with two hands as well, but the grip spacing is much shorter, and the blade geometry discourages close-quarter grappling. Once blades make contact, the longsword has superior mechanical advantage. This is not about technique superiority. It is about geometry. Leverage always wins. At this point, a common objection arises. But the katana is folded steel. It's stronger. This is another myth that collapses under scrutiny. Folding steel was a solution to poor material quality, not a magical enhancement. Japanese smiths folded steel to remove impurities and homogenize carbon content. European smiths did not need to fold as extensively because their bloomery and later blast furnace technologies produced more consistent steel. By the late medieval period, European swords were made of high-quality spring steel, capable of absorbing enormous impact without catastrophic failure. In other words, by the time full-plate armor existed, European metallurgy had already surpassed the conditions that made folding necessary. Again, history and physics align. So where does this leave us? We have two weapons, one optimized for cutting lightly armored or unarmored opponents. One optimized for delivering force, controlling space, and defeating armored enemies. If you place a samurai with a katana against a knight in full plate, the outcome is not poetic. It is mechanical. The katana cannot reliably penetrate plate armor. Its cutting advantage is neutralized. Its lighter mass works against it. Meanwhile, the longsword becomes something terrifying. A precision tool designed to exploit physics, leverage, and human anatomy under armor. At this point, the question is no longer which sword is better. The real question becomes, why do we still believe the katana is superior? And the answer has nothing to do with history, and everything to do with modern storytelling. That is where the real illusion begins. The illusion of katana superiority did not survive on battlefields. It survived in stories. After firearms rendered swords obsolete, weapons stopped being tools of survival and became symbols. And symbols are not judged by physics. They are judged by aesthetics, ritual, and identity. The katana became sacred. The longsword became forgotten. This cultural distortion is the real reason most modern comparisons feel backward. But if we return to real combat conditions, measured, documented, and reconstructed, the imbalance becomes even clearer. Because swords were never meant to fight swords. They were meant to fight people inside armor. Let's talk about impact dynamics. When a sword strikes a target, three things matter. Energy delivered, area of contact, structural response of the target. A katana delivers energy through a very narrow edge. This is ideal for cutting flesh. It is disastrous against rigid surfaces. When steel plate is struck, it does not slice. It spreads force across its surface. This means that unless the blade can either concentrate extreme force at a point, thrust, or deform the armor enough to injure the body beneath, the strike fails. The katana struggles at both. Its curvature reduces thrust alignment. Its lighter mass limits impulse. Its hardened edge risks chipping when subjected to repeated armor contact. European longswords, by contrast, were explicitly designed to solve this problem. This is why European fencing manuals do not obsess over slashing. They obsess over control. A knight was trained to bind the opponent's blade. Step inside the guard. Use the sword as a lever, pry bar, or spike. In half sorting, the blade becomes a rigid handle. The point becomes a tool for gap exploitation, armpits, visor slits, joints. This is not elegant. It is brutally efficient. And this is where physics becomes unavoidable. Consider force redirection. When two blades collide, the sword with greater leverage, superior grip spacing, more mass behind the strike will dominate the bind. The longsword's crossguard, long grip and straight blade, allow continuous pressure. The katana, optimized for flowing cuts, loses mechanical advantage once the fight slows down. This transforms the duel into something unexpected. Not a dance, not a clash of steel, but a wrestling match with blades. And wrestling favors weight, leverage, and structure, not sharpness. Now let's introduce armor again. European knights trained assuming they would be hit. Armor was not a backup. It was a system. A knight could afford to advance into danger, absorb glancing blows, and close distance. A samurai could not rely on the same level of protection. This changes tactics fundamentally. When one fighter can ignore minor hits and the other cannot, aggression becomes asymmetric. The knight presses forward. The samurai must evade. Over time, physics favors the one who can occupy space. There is also the question of weapon durability. Repeated impacts against steel degrade edges. The katana's hardened edge, created through differential heat treatment, achieves legendary sharpness, but at the cost of brittleness. Against armor, edge damage accumulates rapidly. European swords accepted a trade-off, slightly less sharp, significantly more resilient. They were meant to strike steel repeatedly without catastrophic failure. Again, this is not philosophy. It is materials science. At this point, it becomes clear that the katana's legendary reputation comes from context collapse. It is judged outside the environment it was designed for. Just as a scalpel is not superior to a hammer in construction, a katana is not superior in armored combat. Yet popular media refuses to acknowledge this. Why? Because modern audiences equate sharpness with lethality. But in physics, lethality comes from energy transfer and control, and the longsword wins both. This brings us to the most uncomfortable realization. The samurai does not lose because he lacks skill. He loses because his weapon system evolved for a different problem. In a duel without armor, the outcome becomes uncertain. In a battlefield context, it becomes predictable. Physics does not care about honor. It does not care about tradition. It only cares about mass, leverage, and force vectors, and those variables point in one direction. But this still leaves one final question unanswered. If the katana was not superior, why does the myth persist so powerfully today? To answer that, we must look beyond weapons and into the psychology of modern storytelling itself. The myth of the katana survives because modern audiences no longer think like warriors. We think like spectators. Cinema teaches us that combat is about speed, elegance, and decisive single strikes. History teaches us the opposite. Real combat is messy. It is slow. It is dominated by fatigue, mistakes, and pressure. And this is where the final advantage of the European knight becomes undeniable. Let's talk about time under stress. A katana fight assumes resolution through clean cuts. Its tactical logic depends on ending the fight quickly. The longsword system assumes something else entirely, that the fight may not end quickly at all. European martial systems were built for prolonged engagements against multiple opponents, in formations, under exhaustion, while wearing heavy armor. This matters because fatigue amplifies physics. As fighters tire, speed decreases, precision degrades, recovery time increases. When speed vanishes, mass and leverage dominate. The katana's advantage fades. The longsword's advantage grows. There is also the issue of range control. The longsword is not just a sword, it is a modular weapon. At long range, it functions as a cutting or thrusting blade. At medium range, it becomes a lever. At close range, it becomes a hammer, a hook, or a grappling tool. European knights trained seamlessly across all these ranges. Samurai swordsmanship emphasized spacing and timing, but once distance collapsed, options narrowed. This is not a criticism of technique. It is a limitation of design. Now consider battlefield psychology. A knight advanced behind steel. He could absorb uncertainty. He could make calculated risks. A samurai, more vulnerable to blunt trauma and thrusts, had to fight conservatively. Over time, this creates asymmetry. One side pressures, the other reacts. Physics favors the aggressor when protection allows error. At this point, the outcome is no longer theoretical. We have experimental archaeology. We have reconstructed armor tests. We have documented European fencing manuals. And the pattern is consistent. Against plate armor, cutting fails, thrusting into gaps dominates, blunt force incapacitates even without penetration. The katana was never designed for this environment, and no amount of skill can overcome a mismatch between tool and problem. So why does modern culture refuse to accept this? Because myths serve emotional needs. The katana represents purity, discipline, and perfection. The longsword represents pragmatism, systems, and brute reality. Modern storytelling prefers the former, but physics does not reward beauty. It rewards efficiency. Here is the final, uncomfortable truth. If you place a samurai with a katana against a fully armored European knight and remove cinematic rules, no slow motion, no magical steel, no one-hit kills, the fight does not look heroic. It looks inevitable. The katana glances. The armor holds. Distance collapses. Leverage takes over. And the longsword stops being a sword. It becomes a machine for delivering force into human weakness. This does not diminish the samurai. It restores historical honesty. Every weapon is a solution to a specific problem. Every myth is born when we forget that problem. The katana was never meant to defeat plate armor. The longsword was. And when judged by physics, not poetry, the outcome was decided centuries ago.